Yay.
So thank you, everybody. This, of course, is Maureen Orth. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Whose 25 years at Vanity Fair have seen the span in the change of what magazine journalism and celebrity journalism have come to constitute. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But it was you who coined the phrase celebrity industrial complex?
Yes.
So considering that there's a big Eisenhower presence here in this part of the world, tell us what a celebrity industrial complex is.
Well, actually, that happened because I was writing a book called The Importance of Being Famous, and because I had noticed that this was in the early part of the 2000s, the book was published in 2004, and I think it was right around the time the Iraq War, we were in the Iraq War, and they were trying to get heroes right away. And I don't remember if you remember that young woman who was in the war, and she was a female soldier.
Just Han?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. But anyway,
No,
she got
Jessica.
on the cover of Time magazine, and it turned out she had never fired her gun, and in fact, it was jammed up, and the whole thing was just a myth. And we were and then this was around the time that Paris Hilton had become famous because of a sex tape before the Kardashians took that much, much farther. And so this idea that you could become famous for doing nothing, because obviously in the past, if you kind of earned your fame or your notoriety, and it wasn't just about displaying yourself and being an exhibitionist. And so I thought about how many people are involved now as technology progresses. And so I was just thinking that this is a celebrity industrial complex, and it's only gotten worse, and it's really it's so layered now. And I really do think that the Kardashians aren't given credit for all the evil they've perpetrated on our society. And I do kind of think there's sort of a straight line from them to Donald Trump in a way, in terms of how you present yourself and in terms of how you gain an audience.
Well, it used to be that there was a difference between notoriety, which is bad fame,
right,
and actual fame.
Correct.
When did it get so conflated that we don't care whether it's Charles Manson or Charles Lindbergh? It's just that you're famous.
That's why I was thinking I was using the Paris Hilton example of just somebody that shopped a lot and ran around and got famous, started getting attention for having a sex tape, which before would not have been what would call, people would try to hide that and not use it as a marketing tool.
But we've always had murderers who've had a kind
right,
of John Dillinger,
right,
charisma, anti-charisma to them.
Right. But I don't think they were actually marketing themselves.
Yeah. Although his widow did go on a speaking tour, I remember.
Okay.
John Dillinger's, but she wasn't the one who fired the gun.
Okay.
But here in the instance of your book, Vulgar Favors, the assassination of Gianni Versace, here we had Andrew Cunanan, who was a man who was frustrated at every attempt to be what he wanted to be, which was rich and famous.
Correct.
And this was the way he got to be rich, or famous at least.
Absolutely. And I really do think that we don't know for sure because he killed himself, but I really do think that the reason he did kill Versace was to become famous, and because Versace represented everything he was not. Now, Andrew had a 140 something IQ, and he could converse about anything, and he had all these social graces. His position in the Hillcrest area of San Diego, where there were many closeted people, and the military, many closeted military at that time, and so he would put everybody together. And he was also an escort that older closeted men would love to take around because he was young and he was so conversant, but he was never willing to work for a living. And then he got all involved in drugs, and he was just pornography and drugs and S&M, and he began a downward spiral on crystal meth. And so Gianni Versace, I was the one that found out. Do you want me to tell you the story about how this all happened?
Yeah, but do you remember the murder spree across the country that ended up with the murder of or Versace, and then the suicide of Andrew Cunanan?
Right. But what happened was that I was home in Washington D.C. and in my house we used to get 8 newspapers a day. You know, my late husband was Tim Russert, so we got 8 newspapers a day, and I remember reading the New York Daily the Sunday New York Daily News, and there was this little tiny picture of this young man in a black tie, and it said serial murder suspect, and I thought, what? That doesn't look like your usual serial murder suspect. And so then it described him as a former social butterfly from the Bishop's School of La Jolla. Now, I'm a Californian. I know what Bishop's means. You know, I think, what? And so, I had never done a murder story before. So I wanted to see if I could do a murder story, and I brought the idea to Graydon Carter, and he said, sure, you can try it. Go find out. So there was one gay bar that was mentioned in the story, and I just called him up. And this is what happens in journalism. You have to be lucky, and you also have to know how to take advantage of your luck. And it turns out, I said, hi, I'm wondering if I'm from Vanity Fair. I wonder if anybody, you know, you were mentioned and might know Andrew Cunanan. He says, oh yeah, one of his roommates is here right now. I said, put him on the phone.
Well, nowadays he'd say, call my agent.
So that's how it started. But anyway, at that point, that was about 3 months before he killed Versace. And so I had come out to California. I made the rounds of all the gay bars and talking to all the people that knew him. And then he had killed, you know, his former roommate, who was a graduate of Annapolis, who had gone back to Minneapolis and happened to be living in Minneapolis in the same place that the only man he was ever really in love with, this very dashing, nice, very nice young architect. And they were both in Minneapolis, so I went there. I went to Chicago, where he murdered this very rich older man who was very much married. And then he had murdered a man for his car. And he was missing.
Like a park ranger, right?
Yeah, he was actually a cemetery worker in a national cemetery. And so he was on the lam when I started doing my reporting, completely on the lam. But I had found out, just inadvertently interviewing one of his roommates, that he was obsessed with Gianni Versace, and that he had met him once at the San Francisco Opera, because Versace had been brought to the opera to do the costumes for an opera, and all the gay community was all abuzz that Versace was there, and so he got invited to a party through one of his friends. And I interviewed several people who had seen them together just this one night at this party. And then I also interviewed somebody who said he'd seen him in a convertible one night, blah, blah, blah. So I was the only person in America at the time that knew that Andrew Cunanan, except for his friends, actually had ever met Versace. And so...
Let me
What?
interrupt here and explain
Yeah.
how the deadlines work, because as a
Oh, yeah.
daily journalist, I could have written a news story every day while he was crossing the country on his murder spree. Maureen had a monthly magazine, and I don't know what the time was between when you filed the story and it went into print, but the terror that must go through magazine journalists thinking, what if something happens to change my story after I hit the send button?
Right. So we're in the... We've been fact-checked, we're almost at the printers, and all of a sudden this story comes across that the Versace's been murdered, and the suspect is wearing khakis and a white baseball hat, and I kind of got a couple of phone calls. Do you think that could be Cunanan? My researchers say to me, you know, and I started thinking about it. I go, what if it's Cunanan? And they didn't release the name of the suspect. And that was one of their first big mistakes, because it gave them all this time to get away, because they had one eyewitness, and I guess they wanted her to identify him in a lineup. So I call Graydon Carter. I go, this might be Cunanan. But Vanity Fair had just done a big story about Donatella and everybody, their palace in South Beach. And so they sent both Kathy Horn, who was a fashion writer, and me, and saying, if it turns out to be Cunanan, it's your story. If it's not, it's Kathy's story.
So it's either a crime story or a fashion story.
Correct.
Okay.
It's Vanity Fair after all. So anyway, what happened was this is another funny true story. That night, I kept waiting to find out, is it Cunanan or isn't it? And Tim and I had been previously invited to this screening for, I think it was Air Force One. I think I'm not sure if I've got the year right. But
Yes.
I think it was Air Force One. And John Kennedy Jr. and his wife are sitting at the end of the row. And I know that they had announced that there was going to be a press conference at like 8 something.
In Florida?
In Florida by the sheriff. So I have to, in the middle of this screening, kind of crawl past John Kennedy Jr. to get to a payphone to call to find out whether or not it's Andrew as a suspect, and it was. So then, of course, I immediately get on a plane, but since Tim had overheard all this, tells the Today Show, and they send a crew to interview me at the airport.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
Yeah. And to say that I said, yes, he knew Versace. And then when I land in Miami, there are 14 film crews lined up to interview me. And because it had immediately become this huge story, even though in the beginning, Versace was not that well known. He was considered like mostly a designer more for sort of Russian hookers and that kind of that kind of thing. He was nothing what he's like today, and he was not that well known. And I mentioned that even the vice consul who was first notified didn't even know who he was. The Italian vice consul in Miami, he said, who? So then the story then became huge, particularly after the manhunt went on, because there were celebrities and everybody was, Sylvester Stallone, Madonna had properties there, and everybody thought he was trying to kill famous people.
This was like the Manson murders, where he kills Sharon Tate and all of Hollywood is agog and living in fear.
And that is kind of what happened. And then, of course, I found out later many serial killers are very bright people, and they take pleasure in being able to outwit the cops. And so anyway, there were many, many sightings of him around, but pouring in from all over the country. And he was always right there, just in Miami, and he was hiding out on a houseboat. And when just by accident, a caretaker of one of these houseboats was coming in for his usual weekly inspection, and when he rattled the lock, that's when he heard a gunshot, and Cunanan had killed himself. He shot himself in the head at the sound of the rattle.
And no one could ever really unravel for certain why he had done what he had done,
Correct.
to whom he had done it.
Right.
But your book really does give us something that even nowadays we're living with, which is people who have these aspirations to be famous for its own sake. We see girls who put pictures of themselves online just to see if they can get some attention. Mm-hmm. This is really the cusp of a new kind of celebrity wannabe and the celebrity culture itself.
Yes, but the other thing is, though, this was pre-social media. So somebody as witty and as conversant as Andrew Cunanan was, maybe he could have just had it all done with a big Instagram or Twitter following. Maybe he wouldn't have been pushed to such extremes. We don't know that either.
What are the components? If you were to come up with the mathematical formula for what constitutes celebrity journalism, good celebrity journalism, what would they be?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there were a couple of articles that have been written recently that just say there is no more celebrity journalism, because what's happened now, you have such a voracious appetite in media that there's so many different outlets now that have to be fed 24/7, that there's very little reporting that really goes on now for a really long time, or you're given that amount of time to really investigate and find things. That's number one. And number two, the celebrities themselves just totally go above the press, and they communicate, as does our president, directly via Twitter and to their fans. And so the filter of being able to investigate. And the other thing is that now there are so many layers of handlers. I began my career in the early 70s in Newsweek, and I had come from San Francisco And they thought I was this, quote, West Coast screamer. And why would a person who graduated with political science from Berkeley and been in the Peace Corps and worked on Capitol Hill? No, I was supposed to do rock and roll, but that was fun. And so I did Bob Dylan, Stevie Wonder, Bruce Springsteen. But when you did a cover story for Newsweek in those days, and that was about the biggest entertainment kind of publicity you could get, you would hang out with those guys for about 2 weeks and nobody else was in the room. And I would just say, no, I don't want anybody else in the room. I want the that is insane today. No one would ever agree to that today. There's 27 different people in the room and there's all these handlers and you get 5 minutes and it's all just so stratified. So I don't think that it's easy to do. I mean, you can do celebrity investigations, absolutely. But then I think it's almost like mutually exclusive to getting access to the celebrity.
We're in the Didion room, and I'm thinking of the profile that Joan Didion did of Jim Morrison, which essentially constituted her sitting there watching Jim Morrison be Jim Morrison for weeks, just as you said, and that fly on the wall aspect, which is very telling and revealing, is no more. So you really can't find out, in a way, to the benefit of these people, why they are what they are.
I actually had a really interesting experience with Tina Turner because she was brutalized by Ike Turner. I mean, she had pieces, her face bashed in. I mean, he physically was just extremely abusive to her and also mentally abusive and every which way. And so my job, I had done one interview with her for Vogue. And then when I started writing for Vanity Fair, I did another story and I really had to pull it out of her. I really had to get her to trust me, to talk to me, to finally spill it all out. Because it was so interesting. Tina Turner wanted to just be a lady. And she told me that one of her most gratifying times was when she could walk into Armani in Beverly Hills and be treated properly. Because she had, and so she didn't want to revisit all this stuff and what had happened. And so you could only get somebody to talk to you like that and give it to you after they trust you and don't think, that you'll give them a fair break. And I think a lot of celebrities make a mistake today that they automatically don't trust the media. Whereas if you have an honest conversation with somebody, I think they're more willing to,
And they look at the media as a single unitary thing.
Right.
The National Enquirer is not Vanity Fair. And
Right.
a lot of times their handlers don't bother to tell them. This
when Carla Bruni became the First Lady of France, the former supermodel, she's a girlfriend of Mick Jagger's at one point, and she ends up marrying Sarkozy. I had so much fun because she was very media savvy and she knew it. She got it, that she should talk and that not to have all this stuff. So I got her phone number I told her music agent that I had originally done the Newsweek cover story on Bob Dylan and he was a Dylan worshiper. So he slipped me her cell phone number and I call her up and I hear this message. Sono Carla, lasciami un messaggio. And it was so funny. But when I got to her, she didn't have anybody in the room, and she was cool, and she was talking, and then all of a sudden, at the end, she just grabs this pillow and she goes, "I'm the First Lady of France. Can you believe it?"
What a great moment.
And so when you have somebody who sees it that way, you're not going to go out of your way to stab them in the back. You're going to kind of try to write a more nuanced.
To flesh it out to make a full person. And in the case of Tina Turner, you had someone whose story could open the eyes of so many people.
Right.
You worked on the Woody Allen story. We have the Me Too movement, which was an outgrowth of celebrity journalism, investigative celebrity journalism, that has changed women's lives.
Absolutely. Well, the Woody Allen, I talked I don't know how many repeats are here in the room, but I spoke yesterday about both the Michael Jackson investigation and the Woody Allen investigation. And one of the reasons I was compelled to do Woody Allen was because when the story first broke, it was extraordinary, the balance of power. He had the cover of Time, the cover of Newsweek, the cover of, I think, New York Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, 60 Minutes, and the balance. And I thought, what are these charges about exactly? All I've heard is his side. And I was trying to understand how am I'm coming in a little late to this because they had heard something and they wanted me to do it. And so I thought, well, how can I take a fresh angle on this? And I thought, well, let me just go find out Mia's story, and let me go talk to all the people in the household, and let me talk to the tutors and the piano teachers, and of course everybody had a shrink, all paid for by Woody, and it was fascinating because I found out that he had been in therapy for 2 years for inappropriate behavior towards Dylan. And it was his obsessiveness, his obsession with this little girl, and he was like kind of psychologically suffocating her and not allowing her to be 7 years old. At her birthday party, he was leaning, he was obsessed with her. And then, the idea was, well, she's this kooky woman who's adopted all these children, and he was utterly revered as this absolute genius. And but then when you start actually doing the reporting and you find out that he was that there were he wouldn't allow the state prosecutors to get, he wanted to do his own lie detector test. He would not take a lie detector test from the state prosecutors' lie detectors. They found his hair in the attic space and in some of the place, where the alleged thing took place. And he just, and when he exonerated himself on the steps of the Yale New Haven Hospital because they said that they had written a report in which he had been, that Dylan was subject to fantasy and that he was not, they didn't feel that she had been abused. The only charge that the state prosecutor had given at that point was to see whether she could be a credible witness and whether she could withstand a trial. And they never had a pediatrician or a psychologist or a psychiatrist interview either Dylan or Mia, but they had a social worker do it, or 2 social workers, and their notes were destroyed or not made available. They were not made available for any kind of testimony. The only thing that was made available was a sworn deposition by the pediatrician who was their boss. And Woody's attorneys spoke on the phone to them the night before this whole big announcement was going to be made, and nobody ever, told Mia. And so this was just, the balance was so imbalanced all the time that that was something that I thought was extremely striking.
But it has shifted. It has shifted in his case. It's shifted in the case of Harvey Weinstein. I think
it's
not
really
so much
taken a long time. That
but
stuff. I mean, Michael Jackson's, the huge accusations against Michael Jackson when I first started to do both Mia and Woody's story and Michael Jackson all took place in 1993. That's 25 years
Wow.
ago. That's a long time.
A long time for the tables to turn.
Very long time.
I want to ask about your early influences and how they have changed your life today, because you were in the Peace Corps.
Yeah, that was fun. I graduated from Berkeley, and honestly, in those days, in the 60s, there weren't that many opportunities for women. And for those of us who grew up out here, wasn't back east Denver. And people didn't travel that much outside of California necessarily.
Why should we?
Absolutely. True. And so I really wanted to do something different, I felt like, yes, service was a part of it, but one of the big attractions for me in terms of I was sent to Medellin, Colombia, a place I'd never heard of before that was considered, it was called in those days the City of Eternal Spring, very, very beautiful place, and with climate very much like Los Angeles. And I was on my own completely in a barrio, a poor barrio on the outskirts of the city of about 2,500 people, and then this,
Okay, who brought the whoopee cushion?
is it me? Do you
No, I don't think so.
Anyway, so the thing about the Peace Corps that I just loved was that whatever happened after 2 years, kind of, is what you made happen. And I never realized it at the time because I never dreamed I was becoming a journalist. But I thought you have to really understand people and listen very clearly. And the number one lesson I learned, has served me throughout my life, which is so important, is that when brains and beauty and talent and sense of humor and courage, all those things are given out, there is absolutely no discrimination. What's discriminated is opportunity. And living with those people, I understood that at a very basic level. And that was very important to understand. And then you learned how to travel and with nothing. And you had to really listen very hard to learn the other language, Spanish, and to try to figure out where people were coming from because there were so many obstacles. So we ended up building a school, and they named the school after me, which is very cool.
Is it still?
Yes. Escuela Maureen Orth. So I had a romance while I was down there, and I just learned a whole different way of life, and it was so exciting and fun and interesting and challenging. And so in 2000, I couldn't visit there for years because actually Pablo Escobar was hiding down the road from my school, and at one point. And so I think this is me.
Yeah, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe the battery pack. Have we come undone? Oh. Well, that was probably.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll sit very still. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so anyway, I went to visit, and there was a new reform mayor, and he said, and when I came back to visit, the people never forgot me, and they gave me these huge homages of songs and dances and
my.
a lunch and guitars and mass and all of these things, and the ambassador from Colombia to the United States came just to visit, and he stayed a really long time. And the next day, I'm summoned in the Secretary of Education's office, and he said to me, "Listen, Marina, these kids can't compete in the 21st century unless they know English, unless they know technology. Will you please help us make your school the first public bilingual school?" And I said yes without any idea how I was going to do this, because optimism is a conscious choice. And so I just started. And now, actually, I'm going to the airport right from here, and I'm going to Colombia. And I'm working in 21 schools now. We have one laptop per child, computers, and we were the first rural families on Facebook when we started. And I have two nonprofits, one in Colombia and one here. And we teach robotics from kindergarten and leadership and English and math and STEM. And I have to brag because last May in Albuquerque, New Mexico, my all-girls middle school girls team, the Little Engineers, in this global robotics competition, we beat the boys from China, Japan, India, the United States,
Wow.
and Mexico, and we won the gold.
Well done.
So that, to me, is like winning a Pulitzer. Okay.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
And so this is your foundation. How
Yeah,
it's
so this is
dedicated
my
to-
foundation, and I really devote a lot of time to it. And it's, it's hard. It's not, I mean, in order to make something work, especially in public education, the mayor would know. It's just something that you have to work on a lot. It's a huge
That's
challenge.
brilliant.
But I have to say, the other thing that might be amusing is I got this invitation the other day from the mayor of Medellin inviting me to, they're going to blow up Pablo Escobar's building that he lived in.
Oh, you have to go.
In Medellin. It's going to be, for Medellin, it's like blowing up the Berlin Wall, because they're sick and tired of too much tourism concentrated on him as opposed to the victims and as opposed to, it's a very dynamic city. It beat out both New York and Tel Aviv for the most dynamic city in the world in 2016. It's a lot of good stuff happening, and they would like the emphasis to shift.
Well, let's see about some questions from you for Maureen Orth. If you'll stand up, I'll repeat your question from the stage here. So I'm sure, yes, here first, please.
When did you do that article on Newsweek on Bob Dylan, and what did you find most interesting about it?
So when did you do the article on Bob Dylan for Newsweek, and what was the most interesting
He was
thing
my
you found
very
about
first
him?
cover story, and I think it was January of 1974. And women, it was the very first time that there was a woman editor, a woman writer, and a woman photographer. I don't think that it ever happened before. And I had to fly into Chicago where he was opening on Thursday night. The deadline was on Friday. Usually the cover story had to be written by the previous Friday. I had to stay up. I got back to New York about 3:30 in the afternoon on Friday. And I stayed up all night, and I had this wonderful editor who was this curmudgeon, brilliant genius, Jack Kroll, and he never came to visit me, but his light was on at the end of the hall if I needed him, which is great. But anyway, Bob Dylan was a pain. He was just so difficult, because he doesn't talk. And he, and then you have to kind of stand on your head and, do cartwheels for him, and then and ask him. I said, okay, I've done all. Come on, just answer a couple of questions, And so, David Geffen had just become his manager, and I had known him, and that's really how I was able to even get in, and so. Newsweek comes out on Tuesday to the rest of the world. It comes out on Monday right in New York. And so, unbeknownst to me, I told my editors we had an exclusive. And unbeknownst to me, all I did was soften Bob Dylan up for more interviews. So right behind me, David Geffen brings in John Rockwell from the New York Times. And of course, on Monday comes the New York Times interview with Rockwell. Whereas Newsweek isn't hit anything. I was so mad. I called Geffen, I called Rockwell, and I called Dylan. And I was furious, and I screamed at all of them. And two of them asked me out on dates.
Did you say yes to either one of them?
No, of course not.
Another question here. Could you stand up, please, so I can...
What was your opinion of the TV miniseries on the assassination?
I thought
I need to repeat it for the audio. Her opinion on the TV miniseries on the assassination of Versace.
I thought they did an excellent job for the most part. I mean, it's based on, so the parts between Donatella and Johnny, I mean, that's not in my book. But I thought that it was, I was just especially, I just thought that Darren Criss's portrayal of Cunanan was amazing. And he's half Filipino the same way Andrew was. And they physically look so much alike. I thought they had really done a first-class production on a lot of it.
Is Cunanan a hero to some people today?
No.
Unlike other
No.
killers who have...
Not that I know of.
some
Absolutely not.
renown.
No.
Another question? In the back, please. Can you stand up?
What was your opinion on Versace when you were working on the story?
Your opinion on Versace when you were working on the story. About him as a designer or as a person? As a brand.
Oh, well, the brand itself was not doing that well.
Except among Russian hookers.
No, but I mean, it was really, the brand itself really wasn't doing that well at the time. But then it got a lot better known afterwards and things like that. But at the time when he was killed, it was not in the same, I mean, fashion world. there was Chanel and there was Saint Laurent and Balenciaga. He was not in that category.
Another question? Yes, I'm sorry. Here, please. Can you stand up so I can hear better?
Are you currently working on a story?
What you're currently working on, but don't tell the New York Times.
Actually, it's interesting. Right now, it's become an urban myth kind of in Colombia with this film that they submitted for Best Picture that didn't get a nomination. And then there's been a novel, and there's been another movie, now there's another book. There's somehow this urban legend that somehow the Columbia Peace Corps volunteers started the drug business in Colombia.
Oh.
And it is so, to me, utterly ridiculous. It's like trying to prove a negative, but I'm sort of working on that. And then, interestingly, from the old days in San Francisco, there were these hippie drag queens called the Coquettes. And they would get up in this old Chinese movie theater and they had women and babies and guys and all these people. And they were the precursors of so many things, thrift shop fashion, and they were fabulous, and they became the toasts of the town. And then when they went to New York, and everybody just wined them and dined them, and they didn't rehearse, and they bombed horribly. And so I had done a Village Voice, front page of the Village Voice, the history of the hype, Worm, Big Apple, the Coquettes. Well, now the the Metropolitan Museum is going to have a big fashion show opening in the spring called On Camp, based on Susan Sontag's essay. And so there's a Coquettes history that's coming out, and I'm going to do something about that based on, because I flew back with them, and those were those glory days of the counterculture.
That sounds a lot of fun. Yes, here.
Do you have a favorite interview or?
A favorite interview, the question we always get.
I know. I just love all of, I mean, there's some that are much more fun than others, but I love the challenge of them. But I think Karl Lagerfeld was one of the ones I liked very much, and because he's just, he's fun. But then he broke down crying in the middle of my interview, which I was really so surprised, because he had just lost somebody who was very close to him, and that was just this. That was a big surprise to me. But that whole idea of glamour and how he did it, that was a lot of fun. You can't. That was fun. And then the former president of Argentina, who was just completely insane, funny, great. But I told the story yesterday, but he posed in his skivvies with a little white dog on his bed for us. And his campaign.
Didn't Tony Curtis do that without the skivvies?
But anyway, so his campaign manager told me that his two big influences were Machiavelli and Peter Sellers in being there.
Wow.
So
There's an alpha and omega. Yes, here, please.
Is it more fun to write about someone you admire or someone you really don't like?
Is it more fun to write about someone you admire or someone you
well,
do not?
it's more fun to write about someone that you admire, but I think it's exciting to really dig investigatively and really find stuff out about somebody that has remained in darkness. I really think, I did a big profile on Mohammed Fayed, the owner of Harrods, whose son was with Dodi, with Princess Diana. He really was a very, he to me, a very negative, very bad, not a nice person. And he sued Vanity Fair. He sued us to try to divert attention from what the article really said about him. And then we knew he'd never go in the witness box, but to Vanity Fair's credit, they supported me all the way down until about 2 weeks. It was after Dodi died, and about 2 weeks before he was really going to have to stand trial, that he came to Cy Newhouse and said, "I'm a grieving father, let's settle this thing." So we never retracted a single word.
One more question? Yes. Oh, is there somebody who hasn't had one yet? I'm sorry. Oh, okay, sorry.
How do you compare Maureen Carter to the new editor, Vanity Fair?
Okay, on the spot, how do you compare Graydon Carter to the new editor of Vanity
They're,
Fair?
you know, they're two very, very different people, and they're representing different eras. And Radhika Jones is working with about this much of the kind of you know, lavish support that had been given in the past. And so I think that she's very, very bright, and every editor takes time to find what they're going to do and be their best selves, and she's just, you know, in that process right now, but I have high hopes.
So I have a question before we go to everybody on this side of the aisle. Could you just stay in your seat, give Maureen 1 minute to make her get away to go do her good deeds in Colombia? So please thank Maureen Orth and give her a head start.